Okay, so we've got our noise texture. I'm just gonna export this. So I'm gonna go to export as, and I'm just gonna do a JPEG that's gonna be lower file size. And I don't need it to be super high quality because it's just kind of a grain. Okay, so that's pretty good. I'll export this and I will put it in the textures, and I'll just make this noise.jpg. Okay, so with my chair, I'll go down to my file system and look for that texture that I just created. There's the noise, and I have to open this. Go to the albedo, and I'll just throw this in the texture. Okay, so it looks really bad, so we're gonna fix this in just a moment, but notice that it adds this texture on top of the color. So it combines the texture and the color. So if you just want the texture, you can turn the color off. If you like the combination of the two, you can turn it back on. But look how it's like stretched here. Some places it looks good, like on the side, but it's stretched here. So if we're just looking at the top of the chair, that's kind of the effect we want. It's pretty subtle, but it just adds a little bit of grain and texture to the material, but it looks really goofy here. So one of the reasons for that is because we haven't set up the UVs for our model. So this is something that we need to do back over in Blender, and then we'll come back here and take a look at it. So this will only take a second, but I've got to open up Blender, and we've got to look at one of the other properties of our mesh in Blender. So in Blender, I'm gonna get rid of all the stuff in the default scene. So I'm gonna hit A and then X and delete. Let me turn on my screencast keys. And then I'm gonna import my chair model. So I'm gonna go to import GLTF. I'm gonna find my project folder and import my chair model. All right, there's my chair model. It has the mesh and the collider. The collider, obviously, I don't care about that, but the mesh, I want to work with the texture. And so to do this, what we need to do is set up the UVs on the mesh. So by default, UVs are sort of a map of how a mesh interacts with an image. So the UV map overlays with the image to say which parts of the image go where on the model. If we were doing like a lot of modeling and sculpting and making cool textures and stuff like that, we'd go over to this in more detail. But we really don't need to. We just need a UV map to exist at all. So that's actually very easy to do. I can just hit Tab to go into edit mode. And then if I hit U, it goes to UV mapping. And I'm just gonna go to Smart UV Project. I don't even have to open up the UV editor. I don't have to know what this looks like. I can make a pretty decent UV map for a basic texture without doing anything else. So I'll just click Smart UV Project. I'll just accept all the defaults and I'll click Unwrap. And then if I export this again, so I'm gonna go to File and Export, and I'm just gonna replace the model. So I'm gonna, did I select? That's okay, there's nothing else in there. So I'm just gonna export. Hopefully I did that right. Okay, so now the stretching is gone. So what's happened is it has a UV map, it knows where the texture is supposed to fall, and so the texture doesn't get stretched out across the material. Okay, so for just a little bit more info, but we're not gonna edit this, if we go to UV editing, you can see the map that got created here. So when you're in edit mode, if I have an object selected over here and I hit edit, this is the UV editor window. You can see down here, it just says UV editor. And you can see when I do an unwrap, it just makes a 2D flattened out version of all the geometry in my mesh. And so that map is used to map the image to the geometry. And I just use a default. There's different defaults. Like if I hit U and I go to unwrap and I do like that one, you can see it's using the angles. It's using the space a little bit more differently. I still use just the Smart UV project. It's not the most efficient one, but it basically does what I want, and I don't even have to edit the UVs or do anything. You can edit the UVs. If I go into the UV editor and it doesn't look right, I can like grab the UVs and move them around. I don't really recommend doing that unless you're trying to do something specific. Anyway, so we've got our UVs unwrapped. Most models that you download from the internet will already have the UV map, so you won't have to worry about that. It's really only if you're creating your own models. Now that I have the UVs unwrapped, if I go back into my material, if you go to this UV1 section, this is useful because if your texture is not the right size, you can change the scale here. So if I change this to like 2, you can see that the texture is scaled up. If I change this to like 10, it's scaled up to the extent that we can barely see it, so that's probably too far. If I do this at like 0.1, now it's like the dots are really, really big. So probably what I want for something like this is like 2. You can also offset it if you want to, but you can scale the texture up and down. So yeah, that's the basic idea there. You can use these textures for other things as well. So for example, if you want to add a roughness map, I'm just going to use the same noise for the roughness map just as an example, just to save time. But if I go into roughness and I add this noise in here, we'll see if I change the channel to gray and then I play with the metallic and the roughness, you can see that the roughness gets applied to different parts of our material. And you can do this with a lot of other things. Another thing that might be fun is the emission. So let's go to the emission, add this in here. And I'll turn this down a little bit. And let's do multiply. And it's not that... I think the noise is a little too subtle for this. But if we had a better map, that would be more interesting. We can actually create maps as well. I guess I don't really recommend doing this, but if you want to create a texture, you can do it directly in here. So there's a lot of built-in textures. So for example, we could do a noise texture. You can do a gradient texture. There's a bunch of different options here. Let's see if we do a gradient texture, and then you can kind of edit a gradient here. So you can play around with these parameters, change the colors, do different things. And so that can affect the emission map. Let's move this back here. And so this is kind of weird looking, but you can see that our emission is getting applied in a weird gradient now. So again, this is not super useful, but if you wanted kind of a weird stylized look, you could do something with that. But yeah, mostly when you get models, they'll come with textures, they'll come with their own materials, and you can kind of play around with those parameters. But as far as just adding like a little bit of noise or a little texture, you can just make something in Photoshop or download a texture and throw it on there. All right, I've been going for a while, so I'm going to stop there. But all of this obviously is dependent on the look of your scene. So the scene that we're working on right now, just as a quick review, is our garden/fish tank scene. So in this scene, we're just focused on the visuals. We want to design a scene that is encouraging the player to explore and look at different things, but only through visuals, not through the layout or the structure of the level. So we want to focus on creating stuff that's visually engaging, using the different lighting and materials and models that we can use to create visually engaging scenery, but do it in a way that we're not just throwing a bunch of crap onto a scene. Do it in a way that encourages exploration, encourages moving throughout the scene. All right, I'm gonna stop